All right, everyone. Happy Monday. Happy Monday. We are back with another episode of Just Shilling. We took a little bit of a break there. I was traveling and taking some much needed time off, but we are back and I have an incredible guest as we always do with Alice. So we will bring her up shortly here. But before we do that, folks, just wanted to go over some ground rules. This is a safe space. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Want to make sure that everyone is happy to bring them their true selves here and get involved in the conversation as well. But one thing that we will never do here, folks, we will never talk about financial advice. And if it's anything that's probably a little bit too controversial or spicy for a family dinner during the holidays, we will avoid those topics here, although we are all adults and we like to keep this fun. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alice from Notabene. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much, Trevor, for having me on here.
Oh, well, thank you for volunteering to be here. We've talked a while ago, and it's finally the time to have a conversation. So let's start off here by doing, a 30-second minute elevator pitch about who you are and a little bit about your organization. Then we'll kind of go back to the genesis of when it all started for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Trevor. I'm Alice, the co-founder and chief operating officer of Notabene, where I run the go-to-market team as well as the operations team. We are a 4.5-year-old company, and we help institutions in the crypto space be able to transact safely and allow their end users to do safe and trusted transactions. We basically provide them with software that helps them automate real-time compliance checks and risk checks and be able to bring that sort of like safety angle to the space.
Awesome. I love that. Love that. Thank you for sharing that. And, let's kind of go back here and understand, ultimately, one second there, Alice. I want
Software
to
that helps them automate real-time compliance checks and risk checks and be able to bring that sort of like safety angle to the space.
Awesome. I love that. Love that. Thank you for sharing that. And, interesting. Alice, you still there with me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. That was really weird. So I don't know if we're actually live on LinkedIn here, but I think that we are. So I'm just going to keep running it as we normally will. Hopefully, someone can tune in that is listening to the live to make sure that we're actually on LinkedIn. But wanted to kind of go back here and talk about when you started. So, your journey into crypto and compliance, it's fascinating to say the least. Can you talk a little bit about kind of some of the key moments that shaped your decision to kind of get involved in this space and take it back to when you became interested in it in the first place?
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a great question. And I know everyone in the space has a great story about how they landed here. And I think that's always one of the most fascinating things to learn. On my end, it started probably around 2015 or so, and kind of like fast running kind of into where we are today. I probably see like two big things that happened for me. The first one was I was really interested in fintech and the opportunity of fintech products to be able to reach underserved populations and a wider audience. So really being able to bring more investment, landing, savings products, etc. And back then, of course, there were fantastic companies building really great products and tools. However, I felt there was a lot of surface level business model innovations, and it felt that they were being built on a broken core and system that had been inherited from the 70s or 80s, maybe
Hmm.
90s, and just been duct taped over and over. And, from my perspective, it was getting a bit just kind of like frustrating to feel that even though we can reach wider audiences, it didn't necessarily mean that it's lower cost or faster. And if you think about how the next 50 years are going to evolve, it definitely should not be with duct tape. And so, from my perspective, kind of this was like the first, kind of aspect of what brought me to the space, which is, we can't really realize the full potential of broadening financial services without a more fundamental shift in the infrastructure that lies behind it. And only then can you really bring, financial access to more people globally and at a really uh, low cost. The second part of this happened around the same time, maybe a year or two later, but it was when the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke out
Yeah.
with back in the day Facebook. And, ultimately, I felt really, I would say, kind of as an end user, I really felt kind of the dangers and risks of having private end user data be misused by corporations
Yeah.
without your consent and for their benefit. And ultimately, that was a bit of a stark realization for me. At the time, I was back kind of in school doing a policy degree. So I really started looking at this a lot more closely, but thinking around, if we are not able to empower users with managing their own data, and if we can't protect user identity and data online, there's no reason why we don't end up having, whether that's a greedy corporation or a nefarious government, be able to misuse that data. And we can never move towards a digital world where fundamental rights of end users are protected. So if you think about healthcare or financial transactions, those can never go fully digital and shouldn't go fully digital until we solve this problem. And so with those two in mind, I basically, decided to get into the space and work on infrastructure that can help safeguard user identity and safeguard business data and so forth. And so back in the day, it was around 2017, 2018. I sought out different teams in the space and found out about a project at Consensus called Uport, where they were
Hmm.
building decentralized identity and self-sovereign identity tools and building blocks for the space. And that was my entry point into the space. And it was really exciting to start thinking about kind of that, underlying infrastructure that can really help us be able to kind of broaden this financial services aspect. And so, fast forwarding to 2020, which is when we started Notabene, another key moment here for me was realizing that private data sharing is not only necessary to safeguard end user kind of data, identities, and so forth, but also it's critical for regulatory compliance purposes. So the regulators had come in and said, we'd like to um, level the playing field between, crypto transactions and broader, financial services.
Yeah.
But what's necessary here is that we should be able to um, provide kind of the right almost guidelines for institutions to be able to identify high risk behavior, stop nefarious actors, and create trusted peer to peer relationships between each other. It's almost, think of it as every institution in the crypto space is a node, and every node needs to have the freedom to choose who they want to transact with. And so for me, it kind of felt like, the reasons I came to the space coming in together, where I was pretty excited about the emergence of a regulatory framework for the space. It was on a more global level. And of course, here we are today, 4 years later, it's still being implemented and rolled out locally and globally across different jurisdictions. But the power of creating a unifying regulatory framework, even if it has different flavors locally, and the ability to ensure that we're creating rules of the game almost. How do we, what does compliance look like? What does safe transactions look like? What does it mean to have basically say like guardrails here?
Yeah.
And without all this, I didn't feel that the space can actually evolve to its full potential. We can't really open this up to the broader financial ecosystem and have crypto be a larger part of the everyday economy. And so we started Notabene with that in mind. And actually, this has been our mission since the start, which is principally about bringing crypto more broadly into the everyday economy. And, kind of just tying it back, I know this is a bit of a long answer, but tying it back to why, why I got into the space. We've built Notabene while today, we're providing a service to businesses and working with regulators to create a safer ecosystem for crypto transactions. We've also built it on the secure technology that I mentioned earlier around decentralized identity infrastructure. So we're future proofing to really be able to ensure that businesses or eventually end users are able to safeguard their own data and be able to be empowered with the choice of who they transact with.
I love that. Thank you for sharing, Alice. I think that, going in depth that way, it really kind of wraps up the importance of this for people that may not really be focusing on this day to day. And, you had also mentioned that you're trying to focus on really kind of solve this complex compliance challenges within crypto. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the most pressing regulatory issues that you face today, or kind of how does Notabene position itself to address these challenges on a global scale?
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously, this is a nascent space. So when we think about it, it's a nascent market, nascent products, as well as even kind of the regulatory framework is nascent, and that's continuously going to evolve as regulators learn. about the technology as the technology evolves, and as they think about what are the guardrails that will stimulate innovation, but also safeguard consumers and so forth. But tying it into kind of the specific world that we operate in as Notabene and kind of thinking about what lies ahead over the next 1 to 2 years. One of the things that, is interesting about our space is because of the real-time settlement aspect, which is really great, and the ability to be able to transact with a counterpart without identifying who they are and just using a blockchain address. Both
Yeah.
of those are, big reasons why we've been able to create a lot of demand and evolve the space. But at the same time, there's inherent counterparty risk if you don't know who you're transacting with.
Yeah.
Now, you may choose to have anonymous transactions, that's a choice. But if you're looking to buy a service or product from a trusted counterpart, you want to ensure that you're not being defrauded or scammed and so forth. And so this is where it's inherently we do have this, like the blockchain layer is obviously public, immutable, all the rest, and by design it shouldn't have private data shared on it, and by design as well there isn't any person identifiable information on it, and that's why it's powerful. But taking it kind of apart, from a regulatory perspective, they want to ensure that if you're an institution, you're not receiving potentially transactions from a high risk counterpart, individual or business, or from a sanctioned entity, or maybe if a transaction from a country you're not supposed to transact with. And the same happens on the other side. Regulators want to ensure that institutions are not facilitating funds that could go to nefarious activity. For instance, from their perspective, and I think we all agree with that, $1 that goes into something like, building nuclear weapons illegally or terrorist activities, obviously $1 too many.
Yes.
And so they've come into the space and said, look, it's great that there is this real time aspect. However, you should be able to perform pre transaction screening, meaning in real time before a transaction happens. If you're an institution in the space, you should be able to identify who the counterparty is, verify who they are, and make sure that they are not sanctioned, that they're low risk. Obviously, this, what compliance officers are supposed to do here is a risk based decision. So it's not always that they have extremely, 100% kind of identifiable information, but they're supposed to create a policy where they're doing the right checks. And so this is a challenge because we're moving from a world where we were doing everything very quickly in real time, and now we need to add those checks. And obviously, it's being done for a really important reason, which is, being able to de-risk the counterpart. But if you are moving from this little to no checks at the transactional level to having to perform de-risking first, then a critical kind of piece here is how do we do this in a way that it doesn't impact the volumes of the institutions, it doesn't impact the amount of counterparties and so forth. And so this is one of the things that we think a lot about Nota Bene. Um, Maybe I'm going to just provide a second kind of aspect to
Yeah, of
this and then maybe
course.
just briefly kind of brush how we do this.
It helps the
But the other
context,
part
yeah.
of it as well, exactly. The other part as well is that this is a very fast evolving and nascent space. And when regulators say you have to trust who your counterpart is, if you are, let's say, Coinbase, and you're looking to transact with a newly formed entity, based anywhere in the world, because it's a new space, it's hard to know how exactly will you perform diligence on a counterpart institution. What does diligence even mean? How do you assess if another institution has the right compliance checks or knows how to safeguard user data and so forth? And so, because we're still drawing how the space looks like, I would think a lot of those challenges come in. And ultimately, when we say, compliance is, it's often very clear what is expected, but in practice, it's very difficult to implement. And so, from a Notabene perspective, we've come in here to from day one, thinking about how do we make sure that we're building something that really simplifies the lives of our customers and also empowers them to make those kind of like decisions around who they transact with in a way that ultimately benefits their business. And so we do this through, automating all these checks that they have to do. We have modules and features that run seamlessly in the background and really helps them translate how they think about a compliance approach into within product decisions that can be done in real time. And so our approach has been, every institution is different. So we want to give you those tools so you can customize and tailor your approach. And we see this also like, ultimately, like these are challenges that we have to navigate, but by
Yeah.
providing those tools to the space and helping empower our customers, we also see this then as becoming a critical enabler for new entrants in the space. We're able to come in and say, if I'm, let's say, a Chase or Bank of America, I want to be able to grow who my trusted counterparties are in the space. I want to be able to provide a safe ecosystem for my customers to transact with. And so, this is generally kind of our approach here. And maybe one last thing I wanted to mention is I kind of hinted earlier that there's a lot of white space. We're building this together as an industry, as Notabene regulators, as we kind of figure this out. And I think we have to acknowledge that some mistakes will be made as an industry
Yeah.
because we're all learning together. How to create the right compliance checks, how to create the right safeguards, and ultimately that's the feedback from making some of those mistakes as an industry is what's going to help us build better products.
Yeah. I love that. Thanks, Alice. You know, a lot of, I would say, OGs and people that have been in the space and, the kind of more libertarian aspect of crypto, there was a time where a lot of people just wanted this to kind of be a totally Wild West space. And I think that that notion has shifted a lot in the last few years, especially even more recently with all of the advances that are coming with compliance and things like that. So, from someone that's working heavily in this area, do you feel that the attitudes have shifted from organizations that may not have been maybe compliance focused at first, that are trying to put more attention to this kind of? What are you hearing from clients that you're dealing with?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, as having been someone in the space for a long time, it's sometimes easy to kind of be in the midst of it, not realize, kind of take a step back. I do think that um, definitely, I would say attitudes are shifting quite a lot.
Mm,
I referred earlier to, I think the regulatory frameworks are almost creating rules of the game. And so you mentioned Wild West, and the way I think about this is, let's say if we're creating a new sport here, um, we can each sit and kind of play, let's say, whether it's basketball or something like that, any way we want. But only once you create a standard set of operating rules can you then grow basketball into a
mm,
larger,
yeah,
like a larger played sport. And so that's how I view this as well. And I believe that, we're seeing kind of like two, two big things in the space. One is maybe earlier players who had that more libertarian view realized that you need certain safeguards to actually be able to level the playing field across kind of the space and be able to attract and start interacting with a broader, market, both from, I would say, kind of like, from the investor side as well as the end user perspective. And so, kind of looking at where we are today, um, I feel there is general optimism because we're creating trust in this ecosystem. We had a couple of hard years post FTX, and coming out of this, a lot of companies are starting to see compliance as a competitive advantage, but they also see it as the ability to, when there are regulatory frameworks in place, to remove something like jurisdictional arbitrage and actually level the playing field of entry, meaning companies should not be competing on who can do jurisdictional hopping, meaning hopping from one jurisdiction to another until you find something kind of easy to operate in. But instead, it should be competing on great products and innovative services. And I think that's a powerful thing for us as a space.
One of the things that I want to touch up on, and it's really great that you talked about that, the regulatory arbitrage. So, with this landscape, it's constantly changing, especially as more countries are starting to create their own rules around crypto. And some are, much more advanced or further along in their process, and some of them are just starting to kind of get going, if you will, or trying to catch up. So, how do you anticipate these changes across the globe shaping kind of the future of the market? And what's Notabene's strategy to really kind of stay ahead of this, or to kind of put
Yeah.
all of these things together and deal with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's obviously super complicated to stay abreast of what's happening on the regulatory front. You know, I work and breathe, this every single day, and I
Yeah.
still find myself staying behind. I believe the latest data I saw earlier this year was around maybe 80 jurisdictions or so that have passed regulatory frameworks for crypto in the past few years. And every day I hear of new jurisdictions, and that's great news for us. But you can imagine for any institution who needs to be operating on a global level, it's really complex because it's often not just about finding um, how to comply or how to basically meet the guidelines of specific jurisdictions you want to operate in, but in some cases the requirements are also that you need to comply with your counterparts
Hmm.
jurisdiction rules, and that is really tough. And I can tell you that from day one, what we've realized in the space is kind of that in such a fast-paced environment, it's really important to be able to figure out how to distill information, how to find patterns across kind of think about like the different jurisdictional requirements,
Yeah.
and how to help educate the space, because ultimately it's beneficial for every company in the space, for us as an industry, and also for the regulators who want to stay abreast of each other. But an interesting thing with this is, well, we think about it, it's kind of overwhelming if you say 80 jurisdictions. And obviously now with the EU rules coming into effect and MiCA at the end of this month. But taking a bit of a step back, I also think of this as a space where, um, well, it is, I don't know how to express this, but instead of thinking about kind of like every jurisdiction on its own, we're kind of building towards a critical mass.
Yeah.
And I think of this as an inflection point, which we're nearing now, probably with the EU, if not whenever the US kind of regulatory frameworks come up next, where ultimately it almost doesn't matter what the rest of the world, but I mean, the rest of the world will obviously have to implement their own regulatory frameworks. But ultimately, what ends up powering how institutions interact with each other and what kinds of products they put in the market is going to be by almost thinking about that critical mass moment, because they're going to want to basically abide by specific requirements and play by certain rules which allow them to transact with the most counterparties. So they're going to think about it from a business perspective rather than just a regulatory. And so this is kind of similar, when I think about GDPR, where it's EU specific, but you think of most companies around the world taking, whether it's all of the GDPR rules or some version of that, and operating by those principles. Then this is also how I think about the regulatory space here, and I do think we're nearing that critical mass.
And when it comes to, Mika and the travel rule and other things that are happening, from your perspective, what's going to be one of the most significant challenges that these regulations present to different crypto firms, and how do you really kind of foresee the industry adapting? I read something recently that there were several countries in the EU that were really kind of having a hard time or trying to really kind of get all their ducks in a row, if you will, with the nearing deadline for Mika. So talk to me a little bit about that, and some of what your experience has been with organizations as they try to adapt with these deadlines.
Yes, it's definitely a challenge. I obviously here painted the picture of optimism because I think it's great that we're moving towards this.
Yeah.
But like with everything new, um, this is not as simple as a regulator puts in specific rules in place and then the industry has to determine how to comply with them.
Yeah.
Ultimately, there needs to be a constant feedback loop, because the technology is evolving really fast. And in the same way that we as users end up adopting and adapting the technology in innovative ways, so do bad actors. And so the regulators have to really stay on top of this and think about, what are potential gaps and loopholes, learn from the industry what is possible, what is not with today's technology, make sure that realistic things are being put in place. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges, because ultimately, as the policymakers are going to learn from past experience when they put rules in place. But this is one of those things that's really difficult where you have to be looking ahead and kind of thinking, what are those potential loopholes? And you have to be super well educated and super on top of everything that's happening. And so ultimately, we see this. It's stuff for regulators. It's stuff for industry players. It's stuff for everyone. And I'll just bring a quick example, maybe from the EU side,
Yeah.
and then just talk about one practical. I think at least one practical kind of example comes to mind of a really good example of how we worked on that. But on the EU perspective, there's two things happening. The first one is MiCA, which is the broader regulatory framework that they've introduced. It's comprehensive
And can
and
you,
it's
before you get
so
into
good.
this, Alice, can you just kind of break
Yes.
down this, there are people in the audience that may not be familiar with this, so just very on a basic level, kind of help us understand, what Mika is and the travel rule and those things as well.
Yes, definitely. So in the EU, and maybe I can more broadly, but I would say what most regulators are doing is thinking about introducing a regulatory framework for crypto that basically uh, provides what are the licensing requirements for institutions who want to deal with crypto products. It also basically, usually, like those kind of frameworks may also touch on stablecoin issuance,
Mm,
market integrity, consumer protection, what assets should be regulated and how, what assets are not yet regulated, which what type of companies should be regulated and what type of companies not, and so forth. And so when different jurisdictions are thinking about kind of that regulatory kind of framework, there's a lot of variation. And what I've seen coming out of the Financial Action Task Force, which is a global regulatory watchdog that has instituted the requirement for jurisdictions to basically have regulatory frameworks in place. What they've said is a lot of progress on a global level with creating those frameworks and creating those kind of policies. However, they're still pretty basic or standard in most places. But what the EU has done is actually introduce one of the most comprehensive frameworks that touches on most of those elements that I mentioned earlier. Many others will just introduce at the moment, let's say, a licensing framework. But in the EU and under MiCA, they've basically kind of thought very thoroughly about how do we want to think about this technology in the next 5 years, and how do we make sure that we're able to attract institutions to Europe or have homegrown institutions that are able to build on this technology and bring kind of the promise of this technology to the wider audience, but make sure that we are creating kind of a robust framework in place. Now, obviously, this doesn't happen in a vacuum, and they work together with the industry to get a lot of feedback on what this should look like. And it's great that it's very comprehensive, but I would say maybe one of the challenges is, um, you know, it's and sometimes when something's a bit more robust and comprehensive, because it's a bit tough, and you mentioned different EU countries are trying to figure out how to kind of deal with it or roll it out and so forth. In some cases, almost like just being able to figure out resources, both people and the money for an institution to figure out how to operate within this framework, it may be cost prohibitive for many companies because it just requires a lot of education. It requires a lot of spending time learning what this means and how to do it. And there is a bit of a risk that with the EU being ahead of other jurisdictions, that this may create kind of like it it may prohibit some of the volumes that we would otherwise like to see in the European market, or it may just take a bit like more time to adopt or adapt. Um, that's one aspect with Mika. Now, you mentioned also the travel rule, and that's a different requirement. So the travel rule is anti-money laundering kind of requirement that comes from the global regulatory watchdog, the FATF. And what it necessitates is essentially that every financial institution in the space that deals with crypto collect and share customer information prior to a crypto transaction happening to be able to identify who the counterparty is, verify, and if necessary, communicate with the counterpart institution to be able to prevent money laundering and terrorism financing. And this goes back to my earlier points of talking about being able to trust your counterpart and de risking the counterpart. And that's our bread and butter. That's why Notabene exists, our raison d'etre, and so forth. Um, But bringing it back kind of to the EU here, in the EU, it's called the Transfer of Funds Rule, TFR, and that's separate from MiCA. It's related, and it actually goes into effect on the same day at the end of December. Um, but the difference here is this is not just about companies trying to figure out how to operate in a European context, but because the travel rule is about governing how companies transact with one another and knowing the cross-border nature of crypto transactions, then the challenge here is how do companies within Europe or operating within European regulatory kind of jurisdictions continue to transact with companies outside of the EU? And how do we ensure that they're basically operating both in the necessary way to comply with the EU's TFR? And maybe just to make this a bit more, I would say, kind of specific. So the travel requirements in Europe require a European institution to only accept funds from another institution if the travel rules performed. So the
Hmm.
counterpart has to be compliant. It's also on the other side, basically. A European institution cannot transact with a counterpart, cannot send funds to them unless the travel rule happens. And so it becomes a bit messy where in implementation, if institutions in the rest of the world are not ready to comply by this.
Yeah.
And what's required for the EU institutions is if a counterpart does not comply, you have to basically escalate by informing them that they should. If they don't respond within a certain time frame, you have to report them to your regulator and you have to stop transacting with them. And so it's definitely, I would say, like it feels a bit like that critical mass moment where I talked about, or
Yeah.
inflection point, where enough people have to do it for this to work, or else it may impact volumes in the short term.
Now, you've also emphasized the importance of collaboration between, different crypto companies, shareholders, and regulators as well too. Could you possibly kind of walk us through maybe a key partnership that you formed and how you've kind of collaborated to shape a compliant strategy?
Yes, let me think about it for a second. Um, I think I can actually bring a really good example that ties into kind of the challenges that I was just speaking about a minute ago.
Yeah.
So with the travel rule, it's hard. It's almost like a multi-party game, for the gamers among the audience. If you need or your dance partners, right? Like you need the counterparts to play with the same rules. And because different jurisdictions will roll out regulatory frameworks at different times, they'll have different enforcement dates and so forth, it creates a bit of that challenge, which is you can't be fully compliant until all your counterparties and all the jurisdictions are also fully compliant. And there's a bit of that chicken and egg part. And
Yeah.
so last year, we did something very interesting in the UK where the UK is a very exciting market for crypto. The regulators have been super forward thinking. They really want to ensure that London and more broadly the UK continues to be a very important financial hub going forward. And so when they initially kind of thought about their approach, they introduced a pretty robust framework in place. But then they actually also, at the same time, they decided to think about what are maybe some areas that the industry may not be ready yet with those robust framework. And how do we think about what a grace period may look like, or what is almost in a transition period? What do we allow companies to do while they're getting ready? Basically reward good intentions and good behavior, and don't be too prohibitive on the full compliance part if that's not possible. And so at the time, the Her Majesty's Treasury Department and the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the regulator there that deals with anti-money laundering, had invited us to participate in a sandbox. Um, so the rules were supposed to go into effect last September in 2023, and so over the summer we led two sandbox kind of like sessions where the regulator sat in on those sessions.
Wow.
We brought in a diverse group of industry members where they did mock transfers between each other. We facilitated discussions, but ultimately what came out is that those different industry members were able to really shed a light on what is practical, what's not practical yet, where are some of the challenges in the rules as they are today. And they provided a lot of input and feedback. And kudos to the regulator who sat in, learned a lot, continued to work with the industry more broadly, with different industry groups and so forth, and ultimately took some of that input into account as they thought about the grace period. And I think that was a very forward thinking approach. It was definitely very well welcomed from the industry where they felt their voices are being heard. And it was really a good example of collaboration between the industry and the regulator.
I think that's wonderful that, we're kind of thinking outside of the box and getting these different kind of approaches to having this conversation because it's a much needed one for sure. And one of the other things that I was just kind of thinking about, is that for someone new to the crypto space, whether that be an individual or an organization, kind of more so from the business standpoint, do you feel that the attention and the need for this compliance and regulation can be sometimes cost prohibitive to new players? I think you were alluding to that a little bit, right? The startup
Yes.
cost, the legality issue, the just the ability to keep up with all this information. So, do you feel that that can be a little bit prohibitive? And then the second part of that is for maybe new people getting to the space. How important do you feel are crucial is the role of compliance in crypto for maybe people that are looking to start a professional journey in that area?
Both great questions. Starting with the first one, definitely. And I'll say the dangers of almost having the bar set so high where it could become cost prohibitive for new companies to enter the space is we end up not solving the same issues that we've dealt with for so many years in
Mm,
the financial space, where we're just benefiting the more established incumbents who have the resources to be able to, and the luxury almost, to learn about all this.
yeah.
So that's definitely a big concern. And it's one we've thought of a lot from the early days. I won't maybe mention kind of more specifically which jurisdictions, but we've spoken to a lot of our customers who said in some specific jurisdictions, before they ever even are able to launch a product, they've already spent $1 to $2 million
Yeah.
on just setting up and working with the regulator on getting the right things in place. And that's a very high, it's a very high cost of it's a very high barrier. And the other part then becomes with thinking about, how we build tools and thinking about compliance officers have to be trained in the space. There's constant kind of education and re-education. There is, expensive resources that have to be brought into the space. It it could be cost prohibitive, and we need to address this as an industry. We've thought a lot kind of from the beginning. We've always had a free plan to help smaller companies get started with Notabene. We also have a plan exclusively for startups, but I still think it's not enough. And we've launched also some certification courses and training courses. So we try to do a lot here, but we ourselves are also a small company. And
Yeah.
so, we have to think about it more from an industry perspective, and the regulators as well have to definitely be thoughtful about this on how do you continue to allow, or maybe even more, allow more kind of innovation and small startups to be able to grow in the space. And then maybe diving, you had the second question. I believe it was around essentially if you have like new people coming into the space.
Yes.
And so, do you mind just
and and
repeating it?
and
I just
and, and
forgot it.
them
Yes.
and them understanding the importance, the role that compliance will play in the space, and maybe there might be people that are looking to enter in this professionally and try to kind of create their own career path. How important is it, or what advice could you give to new people about just trying to even understanding the complexities of this? How do you keep up with all this? Are there any places where you can gain information to understand this? And really, do you feel that this can be a rewarding career for people that may be looking to enter the space?
Yeah. Um, well, I want to start with kind of taking that step back and saying the reason why I think compliance is so critical here is I
Yes.
take it back to trust. And I would say for every person globally, when you're doing a financial transaction, this is where you need kind of the highest trust. You want to ensure that the transaction you're performing is going to the right destination, that you're sending the right amount of funds, and that you're not being defrauded or scammed. Ultimately, this is kind of the reason why, we trust, and of course, to varying degrees across varying countries, but this is the reason we trust banks and financial institutions and so forth. Because ultimately, you want to ensure that if you're paying for a service or if you're getting paid, it is a high, I'm trying to kind of remember the right word, but it's almost like a high, it's just a high trust transaction, right?
Yeah.
And if we think here to the space, we're never going to build crypto to its full potential unless you have trust and safety built into transactions. Ultimately, you can't use stable coins for cross-border payments and kind of broader B2B trading and all that until we build that safety layer in. And so for someone coming into the space, I would just say it's really simple. It's just about creating that trust and safety in transactions, because ultimately we just risk being a very small and eventually irrelevant industry if we're not able to capture that. And taking it now kind of like a step further, where you said, for new people coming into the space, it's often intimidating because obviously there's a lot happening here.
Yes,
And the
indeed.
first thing I had to learn, yes, when I first started, I had this notebook where I would write all the words that I didn't understand.
Yes, I love it.
And I think by week two or like month one on the job, I was like, wait, this is already overwhelming. And I had to quickly accept the limitations of my own knowledge, but also understanding like ultimately the most important thing coming into this is one, be open to the fact that there's going to be a lot of things you won't know. So you should have a growth mindset, continuously learn, but also accept that it's okay to not know everything because no one does. There's a lot of resources out there. If you need to look it up, you can. Um, and kind of like the second part here also is it is ambiguous. It's a nascent industry, and that's the exciting part of it. So if you find an answer too quickly, it's probably the wrong answer. And so, kind of just taking kind of like with that step, thinking about then like how can someone get comfortable? The most important, I think, traits that I've seen for people who succeed in the space is having a curious mindset. So really kind of being open to learning from others, open to reading a lot of the different kind of like newsletters and kind of blogs and so forth that are out there, podcasts such as this one, and then being able to kind of take a step back and think about like what can I bring to the space. And we
Yes.
benefit a lot in the space from every person coming in from a different from a different industry, because they're going to bring in so many learnings. And because it's nascent here, then we can take those into account and make sure that we're not repeating other mistakes, but really being able to fundamentally change some things and kind of grow accordingly.
And with all of your experience in crypto compliance, and it's obviously evolving at an incredible pace, Alice, is there anything about the industry that surprises you? And what aspects of this space do you think are probably a little bit still underestimated, even by those who are deeply embedded in it?
Yeah, I alluded to the fact that I'm constantly learning here, but what I would say with that as well is it's not just that I'm constantly learning, but I'm also constantly surprised by some of the things I even, found out very early on about the space. And maybe I'll just kick it off with the talent part. When I started in the space in 2017, what I really loved about the space and that was surprising at first was how cross-disciplinary people were.
Hmm.
You grow up in whether it's in school or then in college or then in your first jobs, people people keep creating silos around you, and you have to choose exactly what path you're going to take. And ultimately, when I entered into the space, it was really great to see people coming from all walks of life, very diverse backgrounds, united by the passion and excitement to build a better future. But bringing in those different disciplines has meant that we're actually able to creatively problem solve um, a lot of kind of the pain points that we were seeing. And I think that's really hard to match anywhere else. And 7 years later, I still see this.
Yes.
We've now started, we're hiring for quite a few roles at Notabene. And I love interviews. I love learning about, again, how diverse people are coming in from all backgrounds, whether that's art or economics or psychology. And it's not just about software developers, even though the software developers who we have in the space are fantastic and also themselves have come with very diverse interests. But I think ultimately, like it's just so unmatched. And I think the best part of it, this is it's such a global movement. You really just
Yes.
go anywhere around the world and find some of the most curious and creative and smart people in the space. And it still feels welcoming. It's almost, even though it's a huge movement at the moment, it still feels welcoming to newcomers. And I really think that this is one of our biggest assets as a space, and we shouldn't forget. It continues to surprise me, but I hope that we just take this almost into account to really think about, how do we continue to make this a space that attracts and rewards these type of people, so we can ultimately kind of build a better future with crypto.
Fantastic. And let's just shift gears here. The conversation, it's amazing. I looked at the time here and we only have about 14 minutes. So we're probably going to have bring you back, Alice, because there's a lot that we didn't get to. But I wanted just to, allow you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about Notabene, right? And you mentioned that you're a small organization. You just kind of alluded to talent and finding people, but can you help us to understand maybe a little bit more about the inside, the culture of your organization, some of the things that you've experienced building this from the inception to where it is now, and what are some things that really just make the team special?
I was thinking, Trevor, doing this conversation at the end of the year it's always a great time because you get to self-reflect on what
Yeah.
you've accomplished and maybe in some cases as well what you weren't able to accomplish during the year. But it's also a great time to kind of look back and think about, what have we been doing as a company? And what's been super interesting with Notabene, and I believe obviously it's the same for most startups, is the company's going to almost just change who it is at its core multiple times in its evolution. We have the same mission. That's always been the case. We're still building the same thing, which is essentially kind of like the equivalent of a Swift or Visa net for crypto. So, a trusted transaction authorization network where the participants are able to trust each other and transact seamlessly with each other. That remains the same to build. Um, when we started Notabene, we thought kind of carefully about what are some of the values. And of course, values are not something that you transcribe, they have to be lived. But when we did think kind of about some of the values that we wanted to foster at Notabene, the first one that came to mind was around curiosity and dealing with ambiguity.
Mm,
And as part of that, we think a lot about diversity as an organization. We're building for a global audience. We have companies that transact on our platform across 85 jurisdictions. And so it's really critical that the team that we're building is diverse across cultures, diverse in their beliefs, in their ways of thinking, in their disciplines, because ultimately that's how we can make sure that we don't have blind spots as we build,
yes.
and also make sure that we're able to deliver a product that customers globally will love. And so that ties nicely kind of with that curiosity and kind of ability to navigate ambiguity. And those are kind of two of the things that we wanted to, foster early on at Notabene. Now, fast forward, of course, we're a team of around 40, and we'll probably be around, 50, let's say, in a few months' time. And the culture has obviously a life of its own. And it's really exciting to see some of those same sentiments continue to be there and grow in their own ways, obviously being shaped by the people in the team today. Um, but one of the things as well, we've had to learn throughout is in a startup in general, but in crypto more specifically, the highs are really high, but the lows are sometimes super low.
Mm,
And it's important that we sometimes just take a bit of that kind of step back and kind of think as well as Notabene and within kind of a team culture. It's like, how do we not take ourselves too seriously?
yeah.
How do we make sure that we're able to navigate through those lows in a way that reminds us that we're building something meaningful, that we're having a lot of impact on our customers, and that we still love what we're doing day to day? Because ultimately, we have to be able to navigate through those kind of challenging times sometimes.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. So let's just kind of shift it here for the last 10 minutes or so to a little bit more lighthearted questions here. And, as someone that is involved in this, and as you mentioned, I think that when we chatted before, you had felt like you had an 80-hour work week, right? So, and I think you mentioned that that's probably not sustainable. And I think that most people that work in this space, we feel like we're always connected to this. So, if you had a chance, Alice, to disconnect, I know even though it seems impossible at times from this fast-paced crypto world, while and explore or either do anything, where would you go, and what are some of the activities that you would be involved with?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe it also goes to the type of people attracted to the space. Ultimately, we're people who love that ambiguity. We love the fast-paced and dynamic part.
Are we crazy?
I think we're crazy. And I think because of that, it's really hard to switch off. I see like myself, my friends, my colleagues, etc., like watching all these podcasts on the weekends and kind of like, just staying really kind of like meeting with a lot of crypto people, etc. But it's really hard if we don't like think thoughtfully and intentionally how to step back from this because ultimately we're going to burn out.
Mm,
And I had, one of my former mentors or still a mentor, but team members in a life before Notabene basically say, this is a 10-year, it's a 10-year journey.
yeah.
And you need to really kind of think about what's the impact you want to have during those 10 years and just remember that along. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint, and so forth. And so, it's important for us to think about to kind of take those moments. And so I know it's hard. We did talk about this before, but some of the things that, I've been trying to be more kind of thoughtful about instituting in my day to day is making sure that, thinking about kind of like self care.
Yeah.
One thing is, if you're traveling for work or if you have intense periods, you end up letting go of your routines. And if routines mean like working out 3 times a week or you know, having physical therapy or whatever it is, you may let go of those. And it's really critical to not break those or when you have the chance, be able to build them back.
Yes.
The second thing that I am personally very excited about, because I'm doing this next, is first of all, have kind of instituted more time deliberately kind of every week to read fiction. I think this takes me away from crypto related podcasts, books, etc., and makes me really be able to think a bit more, a bit more kind of creatively and think about kind of the world out there in different ways. And my favorite way to do this is obviously to be in a place in nature.
Nice.
And so, I will be taking a break beginning of January and going to Argentina to the mountains there in
Oh my
Bariloche,
goodness,
where
amazing.
all I'm excited to do is have my 3 fiction books and just read them, hiking, and kind of like enjoying nature.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. That is amazing. Everyone loves to ask the question about what keeps you up at night, but I'm going to kind of flip the script a little bit and, ask what makes you at peace? What gives you comfort and can make you fall asleep at night like a baby?
Oh, I love that. Um, I think there's 2 things maybe that come to mind. The first one I would say is the people that I work with. I think, again, we're all, as I said, kind of extremely passionate and excited about what we're doing next. But we also all feel that we are, like sharing kind of this role of creating an impactful kind of future together,
Yeah.
which makes it easier to fall asleep at night or to disconnect when needed. Um, the second part is, I would say, kind of just a general optimism. I think even in the harder times in the space, I think just again, like thinking about the people that we interact with day to day, it's just, really realizing that if we're building the next 50 years, like what may seem tough over a month or two is just a blip and no one's even
Yes.
going to remember this. And it's part of that learning process. And so I would definitely say kind of like that's the second part. Yeah.
Be kind to yourself. We're all learning.
Be kind to yourself. Exactly.
No
And maybe,
one's. Yeah, go
yeah, sorry, go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, because maybe the last part where you're saying here, be kind to yourself is also like most things are, it's okay if there was a mistake somewhere. Again, we're all learning here. And I think that ultimately can help you sleep better at night. Like it's not the end of the world.
I love that. I love that. You know, building Notabene, I'm sure this has been a rewarding experience for you and an incredible journey. Was there ever like a single moment when you felt you really truly kind of found your stride in the space, or was that more of an evolution?
Oof, that's tough. Definitely no single moment. I think, and maybe this is also just like a character kind of specific thing, but I feel that I approach this from like a growth mindset perspective, which is I need to accept at any given moment that I need to be comfortably uncomfortable
Yes.
because the space is just, evolving fast and you have to stay on top of it by knowing that there are things you don't know and you have to continue to grow, which is why I think of it as an evolution. And obviously, if I look back, I'm going to think of specific moments. First time we were invited to speak to a regulator, or you know, or first time where a customer, you know, gave a lot of great feedback about our product, and so forth. There's obviously always like great moments where I felt like, okay, this is a great kind of time, and I feel we've accomplished certain milestones. But I think if we get comfortable with that, we kind of, I think we'll never become a much bigger company as Notabene.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, ending it here, I like to do a little fun segment called Bearish Bullish, and talk about some of the things that are trending in the industry that I'm sure most people that are following are aware of. But there's been a lot of attention for stable coins, right? And I know that this is something that you're involved with as well too. When it comes to stablecoin and all of the talk. I know that Ripple RLUSD just recently got approval for a new stable coin. There's a lot of other organizations out there. A lot of people are starting to talk about this. Are you bearish or bullish on stable coins?
Super bullish.
And why?
Yeah, just super bullish. Maybe going back to almost my first point here of what got me into the space, and I talked about broadening financial services and the ability to give, new products to people globally. And I think with stablecoins is how we get there, especially when I think about cross-border payments, e-commerce, etc. Obviously, we're still very much early in the beginning, but I think that this is how this is how the world is going to look in 20 years, and we're in the midst of building it today.
Love that. Love that. And in terms of you're obviously working with a lot of institutions, and you had mentioned kind of keeping the ethos, this really kind of collaborative feel in the space. And there are a lot of people that, maybe might feel that as bigger traditional organizations come in, that they can kind of somewhat change that culture. So when it comes to just working with institutions and institutional adoption overall, are you bearish or bullish on that?
The issue here is I am a general optimist, so I'll probably say bullish. But what I'll caveat here is I think we often, when we think about kind of like incumbents, I think we give them a lot of credit. And they have to basically really compete and stay on top of it and be super innovative to remain relevant over the next many years. And so I think they need to work hard. It's not just, crypto institutions and companies that have to kind of work hard. And that's why I think I feel bullish because ultimately, like, I think innovation is just what's going to kind of help push things forward.
Fantastic. Uh, Another trending topic that's not new to most people, that there's a lot of talk about AI, right? And I know that there's people that expect it to be a bit of a convergence, if you will, Alice, with AI and blockchain and cryptocurrency. And there's agents that are, doing things on chain. What are your thoughts on that? Bearish or bullish on AI?
Definitely bullish. It's kind of funny. I was in a panel maybe 5 months ago where we had to we we basically had to both pitch the bullish and the bearish part of that. But definitely very bullish. Again, kind of thinking to both kind of like the blockchain and crypto space unleashing its full potential. I think we do this with agents. Ultimately, this is kind of just the way to go. But then the ability to have those autonomous agents be able to use to seamlessly transact with stable coins and kind of other things like this is going to be how maybe kind of like the convergence of both industries as well will help kind of a fuller potential with both. Now, are there some guardrails required? Probably yes. Again, just to protect the rights of people and protect the
Privacy, yeah.
data privacy.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep. Wonderful.
Yep.
Well, our time is up here. I wanted to leave the last minute or here or so. I don't want to go over the time. I know that you've got a ton to do, but how can people, Alice, keep in touch with what's going on with Notabene? I know that you've been on a little bit of a world tour yourself and many different speaking engagements. Is there anything that people can do to stay, abreast of all of the incredible things that are going on? Anything particular in your roadmap in the near future that you want to share? And how can people get in touch with you, whether if they're trying to collaborate? I know that you mentioned that you were hiring. Kind of give us the lowdown there.
Yeah, definitely. So the nice thing with Notabene is we are a global company, so we have people all around the world, and we will definitely be, attending a lot of kind of like the key um, conferences that make sense for us to be at over the next year. So definitely look forward to meeting many of you there. But I would say probably the best way to engage with us is through either LinkedIn or Twitter, and maybe even more so LinkedIn. But our team has been really kind of intentional about the content that we put out there to help people in the space, both new to it and who've been here for a long time, be able to quickly learn about specific topics. We have a lot of webinars that are open to the public, and we try to make those as engaging as possible. We also have trainings that we give out and stuff like that. And so we have a wealth of, I would say, kind of like great content that can be really great for you to learn more about Nota Bene, learn about the space we operate in. And then I would say, most of our team is also on LinkedIn, so you can feel free to reach out to me or others there.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, Alice, this has been an absolute pleasure. We didn't get to all of the things that we wanted to talk about, but like I said, I'm probably going to have to bring you back on again. And, who knows how much will change in the space between that time and now. But I really appreciate you for sharing your incredible insights, for being here on a Monday. I know it's a little bit later in the day where you are, so hope that you had a great one and this was a good way to end it. But thank you, everyone, for joining that came to this podcast. I know that you have a million things that you could be doing, so I appreciate all of you. Look forward to our next conversation. And for those that didn't get a chance to tune into this live, we can go back and check out the replay, and I'll also be uploading an audio of the conversation on YouTube as well too. So thank you so much, Alice. Thank you everyone for joining. Have a great day. Take care. Bye, y'all.
Thank you so much.